Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Uddevalla, Sweden. Mid-November 2019. A 17-year-old named Wilma Anderson stops answering her phone, misses a routine check-in, and fails to appear where she's expected. No theatrics, no chase, just a clock that doesn't move the way it should. Patrol officers begin with a welfare check, confirm the last known contacts, and escalate. In towns like Uddevalla, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. This isn't a campfire tale, it's a case file. Investigators start with the same three anchors you'd see in a U.S. task force: last known location, most recent communications, and who had access. Friends and family provide times, messages, and recent movements. The early picture is clean, too clean. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The search footprint widens in hours, not days. Officers coordinate with Swedish missing person protocols, preserve digital accounts, and request voluntary device surrender from those closest to Wilma. A short list of contacts becomes a shorter list of people who saw or heard her last. No credible sightings away from town. No ticket, no trip, no verified departure. The absence of a trail isn't proof, but it is pressure. When the timeline narrows to one small apartment connected to Wilma's private life, the approach becomes methodical. Entry is controlled. Scene security is logged. Photography precedes touch, touch precedes collection, every collection is sealed and signed. The room isn't dramatic, but it's important. This is where investigators decide whether a teenager simply went silent or whether something irreversible happened indoors. Neighbors recall a single scream inside the relevant window of time. It's not a narrative flourish, it's a statement logged and cross-checked against phone inactivity. Officers avoid bias by testing alternatives in parallel: voluntary disappearance, medical crisis, third-party encounter elsewhere. Each hypothesis needs a door to walk through: bus cameras, bank activity, geopings, any credible handoff. No door appears. What does appear is a reason to treat this apartment as the focal point of the search. Notice what we aren't doing: we're not guessing motive, not projecting relationships onto the evidence, and not declaring a killer. The standard is facts that survive court. That means the next step is forensic: document the interior, preserve trace, and determine whether biology supports a simple missing person report or a felony that changes everything. If you've watched enough cases, you know the pivot doesn't come from speeches. It comes from what a lab can certify and what a court can hear. The door closes. The room is sealed. What's inside will decide whether this case stays a disappearance or becomes Sweden's most closely watched homicide of 2019. The apartment is cleared the way any competent team would do it: entry logged, body-worn cameras active, exterior hall photographed before anyone crosses the threshold. I'm walking you through it simply because this is where a missing person file either holds or collapses. We keep it tight: what's visible, what we can bag, and what moves the clock forward. No dramatics, just steps that stand up in court. First pass is visual. Officers confirm doors and windows as found, note the thermostat, and record the state of lights and blinds. Nothing here proves a crime, but normal matters. A lived-in room that looks suddenly static is a data point: when, not why. We don't speculate in this phase. We document, then we test our assumptions against what the lab returns. Collection follows a simple hierarchy. Items that can lose information quickly go first. Anything wet, any small trace at risk of transfer, gets priority. Textiles are paper-bagged, sealed, and labeled. Swabs are taken where there's an obvious need to know who and when, not to color a story. If you've seen cases go wrong, you know overcollecting can bury the signal. Here, discipline is the point: photograph, collect, seal, sign. Every bag has a handler. Every handler has a timestamp. Parallel to that, a second team pulls the apartment's digital life. Routers, game consoles, set-top boxes, anything with recent power on. The question isn't who did this, not yet. It's who was here, and when did the room go silent. Phone chargers, wearables, and recently used personal items are noted, not to invade privacy, but to measure routine against the moment the routine stopped. If a teenager vanished because of a voluntary choice, a certain pattern of digital noise usually follows. If that noise is missing, you don't guess motive, you mark the absence and ask what else is missing. Neighbors are recanvassed while the scene is held. Times are nailed down. Statements that mentioned a scream are matched to the device inactivity window. It's not about one witness, it's about whether multiple sources agree inside a tight range. If they do, you get a signal. If they don't, you keep searching for the next corroboration and resist the urge to stitch a narrative too soon. The data aligned too cleanly, I said earlier. Sometimes that was the problem. Today, the cleaner the alignment, the more we check the edges for anything out of place. Nothing about this apartment suggests a staged break-in. No pride strike plate, no glass that tells a story you can't fake twice. That matters, because it pushes the focus inward, not toward strangers in a hallway, but toward who had reason and routine access to this space. Access isn't guilt. Access is opportunity, and opportunity is a filter. Back in the room, technicians lift latent prints from touch points that make sense, door hardware, a few appliance controls, the immediate surroundings of a compact storage area that draws a careful look. Again, no theatrics. You open, you photograph, you seal. Containers that could hold small items of evidentiary value are not emptied at the scene, they're stabilized and logged for controlled examination. This is how you avoid contaminating what you haven't measured yet. A quick note on ethics, because it matters to viewers, families deserve answers, not rumors. When we say trace or biological material, we're not using euphemisms to dodge reality. We're using professional language that protects both dignity and the integrity of the case. The goal is accountability, not spectacle. Once priority items are secured, a concise inventory is read back against the collection log. The team confirms that every seal number appears exactly once and that photos match the count. If you're thinking this sounds procedural, you're right. Cases don't hinge on speeches, they hinge on whether this list stays clean from here to the courtroom. From the outside, the apartment looks ordinary. From the inside, it now holds only what we can prove. When a teenager doesn't call back, people think about motives, betrayals, secrets. Investigators think about sequence. Sequence tells you who had time, who had access, and whether the room tells the same story twice. We close the door because the next part isn't about looking around, it's about what controlled examination of sealed evidence says happened here. There's a human piece to all this. Routine is the backbone of safety for most families, the text that lands, the door that opens, the light that switches off. When those things stop, it isn't paranoia to ask for help. It's smart. If you hear something off, like a cry inside a narrow window, call it in. You're not accusing anyone, you're helping someone keep a clock accurate. We exit on the same log we used to enter. The apartment remains the sole locus of interest. No detours into alleys or fields, no second scene invented for effect. The evidence will leave the story room by room, bag by bag, and land where it should, a lab bench, a timeline, a charging document. That's how a missing person file becomes a case with answers. The sealed items from the apartment do not go to a back room and vanish into paperwork. They move in sequence: receipt, photography, controlled opening. I'm walking you through what matters and nothing else. One compact container draws priority because of where it was found and because its exterior swabs suggested more than routine handling. The exam is recorded start to finish. No shortcuts, no assumptions. The lid is eased open inside a ventilated hood with a second examiner witnessing. The contents end the debate about status. We will not describe them in detail. It is enough, and accurate, to say the discovery confirms death and anchors it to that apartment. The classification changes in minutes. A missing person file becomes a homicide investigation with an associated charge for post-offense handling of remains under Swedish law. This is not rhetoric, it's the point at which procedure obligates investigators to treat the room not as a place someone left, but as the place where a fatal event occurred. Once classification shifts, the question narrows: what can be proved about timing, mechanism, and who had opportunity during the relevant window? The lab steps in with fast, necessary workups, identification by comparison to known records, trace collection from the container, and triage of textiles already bagged from adjacent areas. Again, nothing graphic is required for you to understand what the law needs: positive identification and linkage to the space where the evidence was found. That linkage is the spine of the case. Investigators follow the sequence, not their emotions. The apartment remains the sole locus. There is no pivot to a wooded trail or an abandoned lot. There is no second scene. The working model is indoors, bounded, and testable. When the lab confirms identity, the next move is a re-interview cycle focused on access, routine, and inconsistencies. People connected to Wilma are asked the same tight questions twice, sometimes 3 times, not to trap them, but to check whether their timelines agree with the lockdown clock the room has already given us. Digital artifacts are read for context rather than drama. Router logs, device uptimes, and recent power events answer simple questions. Was this apartment active when it should have been quiet? Did a device that usually travels stay put? Did anything connect or disconnect right around the silence that triggered concern? These are not abstract puzzles. They form a pattern that either supports the theory of an in-apartment fatal event or breaks it. Here, the pattern holds. When a pattern is this consistent, we double-check the edges, because clean data can be seductive. The data align too cleanly, sometimes that is the problem. We verify anyway. Investigators return to the container's origin point inside the apartment. The surrounding surfaces are re-swabbed for transfer that could date handling. A narrow set of touch points yields a short list of prints that, taken alone, would not be decisive in any busy household. But in a tight window, with confirmed death and no sign of outside entry, routine access becomes a filter with teeth. Who had a right to be here? Who was here when the ordinary day turned into a timeline with gaps? Those questions are not solved by speeches. They're answered by whether fingerprints, DNA, and digital presence attach to the points that matter at the times that matter. A word about respect, because cases like this often spark debate about coverage. Speaking plainly about classification and evidence is not the same as turning a person into a file. Wilma Anderson was 17. She had a network that reported her missing quickly. She had a life that generated the routine we've used to measure this silence. The reason to follow the steps exactly is not just to secure a conviction, it is to honor the reality of what happened without turning it into spectacle. With classification complete, the case team drafts the first charging package. The language is spare. It ties identity, location, and post-offense handling to the apartment. It presents the neighbor reports inside the device inactivity window, and it flags the absence of a credible outbound trail. It does not argue motive. It does not speculate about planning. It asks a court to accept what the evidence can carry right now while continuing to test every alternative explanation that fits the facts. From a storytelling perspective, this is the moment a lot of audiences expect: names, motives, and confrontation. That isn't what real cases give you. They give you a room, a timeline, and a set of objects that either agree with each other or don't. Here, they agree. The appropriate response is to go slower, not faster. When the pieces lock this tightly, you safeguard the chain, you narrow your questions, and you let the next layer of analysis, microscopic trace, digital proximity, and corroborated statements, do the work. The door to the apartment closes again, seals checked, logs signed. The case is different now, but the approach hasn't changed: one scene, one clock, one standard of proof. If you were running this investigation, which angle would you press first after classification, re-interviews with a tighter time window, or deeper digital correlation inside the exact minutes the room went silent? Classification changes the posture of an investigation, but it doesn't finish the job. With the apartment established as the only scene, the next task is to compress time until the number of plausible minutes shrinks to something you can defend in court. You don't get there with drama. You get there by stacking small, verifiable signals that agree even when you try to pull them apart. We start on the evening Wilma goes dark in mid-November 2019. Her phone stops returning the normal pings that show background life, notifications delivered, read receipts toggled, incremental battery drain during use. The handset doesn't move on the network the way it usually does across a day. Friends who text her receive nothing. Calls route but don't connect. This isn't yet proof of violence, it is a pattern break that marks the beginning of a window. Inside the apartment, home electronics become witnesses. The router's session log shows which devices associated and when they last talked to the network. A set-top box reports a power event and then sits idle. A laptop that typically wakes from sleep in the late afternoon never checks in. None of these facts alone tells you what, but together they tell you when the room went quiet. The tighter the room's silence matches the phone's silence, the more credible your window becomes. The building offers another layer, not a dramatic camera revelation, just reliable routine. There's no verified footage of Wilma leaving the entry after the time friends stop hearing from her. There's no transit ticket purchase, no bank withdrawal, no food order that maps to her account. Investigators confirm with transportation vendors and financial institutions, so this isn't guesswork. If a teenager planned to go somewhere, there is usually a sign, a bus card hit, an ATM interaction, a ride-share receipt. Here, the ledger stays blank at the exact point the devices stop talking. Now the human side of the timeline. People close to Wilma provide the last normal contact and any planned activity. Times are written down, then checked again after the digital pull is complete. Re-interviews are not about pressure, they are about accuracy. When someone claims a conversation lasted about 10 minutes, you compare it to the call detail record. When a person says, "I left around 1:30, you measure that against the building's known comings and goings and the period when the apartment's network went idle. Small differences happen, big ones need explanation. This is where the narrative most often falls apart in weaker cases. In this file, the narrative doesn't break. The data align too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. So the team verifies edges instead of congratulating itself. Edges matter because they tell you whether the window you've drawn is real or the byproduct of coincidence. Investigators look for noise that would widen it, a stray app heartbeat from Wilma's phone after everyone thought she was offline, a late-night DHCP lease that would prove the router stayed busy, a cash purchase that slipped through digital nets. Nothing credible widens the gap. That silence, corroborated across sources, becomes the strongest thing in the room. Opportunity narrows next. You take the window and ask a basic question: who could be inside that apartment during those minutes, with routine access, without creating the signs of an outside entry? You do not speculate about motive, you measure presence. People tied to the space account for their movements. Their device histories are compared to the apartment's quiet period. If someone says they weren't there, their handset should agree. If they claim to be home and asleep, the inactivity should show consistent patterns across their devices. Experienced teams don't chase one inconsistency, they look for clusters. Clusters are hard to fake twice. Nothing in this compression introduces a second scene. The focus stays on the apartment because that is where the evidence lives and where the classification changed. The strength of an investigation like this is that each line, phones, home devices, statements, and schedules, points to the same short span when routine stops. That span becomes the answer to a jury's most important question: when could this have happened? Everything after that is conduct, what someone did once the window shut. One more human note, because it's easy to forget the life behind the signals when you're measuring seconds. The reason investigators are careful with times isn't to win on a technicality. It's to make sure the story we tell matches the life that was actually lived. Families deserve certainty, not theory. You don't build certainty by talking longer. You build it by checking whether each timestamp holds. When the team finishes the compression, the result is not a guess. It's a measurable interval that aligns Wilma's phone going dark, the apartment going quiet, and the absence of any legitimate exit. The next step is to connect that interval to confirmed presence and actions inside the unit, what was touched, what was moved, and what was handled after the fact. Sequence, then conduct. That order keeps the case clean. The window is now small enough to matter. The question is whether someone's movements fit inside it without leaving a trace they can explain. The lab answers the question Chapter 4 created, not just when the apartment went quiet, but what happened inside that window. This part isn't about theory. It's about results you can read into the record without guesswork. First, identification. Biological material recovered from a sealed container taken from the apartment is compared to known reference samples. The match is positive for Wilma Anderson. That single result ties the loss of life to one room in Uddevalla and ends any remaining speculation about whether she simply left and cut contact. With classification already shifted to homicide, the case now needs sequence: what was done, in what order, and by whom. Technicians map where Wilma's DNA is present and where it is not. The pattern is not random. It concentrates in specific interior zones and does not appear on the building's exit points or exterior common areas. That matters. It supports an indoor event and undercuts any claim that a third party forced entry and fled through halls or stairwells. It also fits the digital silence we locked in during Chapter 4. When your physical map and your timeline agree, you have direction. Next, touch evidence. Latent prints are lifted from high-probability surfaces in the room, handles, storage lids, and nearby fixtures. This is not a TV reveal. In busy homes, prints typically resolve to people who had every reason to be there. That's true here, too. But in a narrow time window, normal access becomes a filter, especially when the same names appear at multiple touch points that surround a container the lab has already linked to Wilma. One presence can be expected. Multiple touches in the exact area of interest, during the silence, are the kind of cluster prosecutors can explain to a jury without dramatics. The lab also looks at transfer, tiny particles that move when objects are handled. Fibers, trace residue, and microdebris around the container and adjacent textiles indicate post-event handling. None of this requires gore to be clear. Handling happened. It happened inside the unit. It happened during or shortly after the interval we've already established. That's conduct, not accident. Because only partial remains are recovered, the forensic pathologist is limited. The cause of death cannot be reconstructed in the way a full autopsy might allow. But classification doesn't require that here. You have identity, location, and conduct consistent with a violent event indoors, followed by deliberate handling of remains. Swedish prosecutors use the same logic American juries understand. When multiple independent lines point to the same conclusion, you do not need every line to carry the entire weight alone. Digital forensics continues alongside biology. Device logs show that personal electronics associated with routine use in that apartment stopped their normal pattern in the same interval Wilma's phone went silent. There's no credible activity suggesting she left to meet someone or traveled out of town. The room turned off, her phone turned off, the evidence of a fatal outcome is found inside that room. You can draw a straight line between those points without inventing anything in the middle. Re-interviews now tighten around conduct. People with routine access to the apartment account again for where they were during the window and what they touched. Inconsistencies are small but important. A person says they didn't handle an item that, according to prints and DNA, they clearly did. Another says they left earlier than the router log suggests. These are not dramatic confessions. They are the kind of measurable conflicts that shift a case from suspicion to proof. One ethical point is worth saying out loud. Precision protects people on both sides. Families deserve a process that proves, not imagines. Those named in an investigation deserve that same discipline. That is why this narrative keeps returning to clocks, logs, and lab sheets instead of speculation. The facts here are strong enough to stand without extra words. By the end of this phase, the case file reads cleanly. Wilma is positively identified. The apartment is the single scene. The physical pattern is indoor and deliberate. The time window is small. The conduct surrounding the container shows handling after death. The digital context supports all of it. There is no competing story with equal footing, no verified departure, no credible outside attack, no second location with matching evidence. It is one story, told by different kinds of proof that point to the same minutes and the same room. That leaves the next move: convert this convergence into charges that reflect both the loss of life and the post-event acts. Prosecutors don't need to guess at motive to do that. They need to show what the lab can already say: who was present, what was touched, and how the room changed from ordinary to silent. In towns like Uddevalla, crimes don't just break the law. They break routine. Here, the break is measured. And now it's documented. Classification gave the case its footing. The file now has to speak in the language a court accepts. Prosecutors in Uddevalla move on 2 counts, murder and post-offense handling of remains. The charge sheet is spare: identity confirmed as Wilma Anderson, location anchored to the apartment, and conduct consistent with a fatal event indoors followed by deliberate handling. No motive thesis is offered, the evidence itself is the argument. Pretrial work pairs the case to what a judge will admit and a jury can track. The state presents 4 pillars. First, identification from the sealed container recovered inside the unit, establishing death and tying it to that address. Second, DNA distribution that maps to interior zones and avoids exits or common areas, undercutting any scenario of an outside assault with escape through the building. Third, touch evidence clustering on the container and nearby fixtures within the compressed window already established by device silence and network logs. Fourth, the absence of legitimate outbound activity by Wilma: no travel, no banking, no digital signature, aligned precisely with the apartment going quiet. In court, the order matters. The prosecution starts with the room itself. Photos of the scene, taken before a single item was moved, establish how the apartment presented on entry. Chain of custody is documented once, cleanly, before any lab result is introduced. Then the sealed item's handling is walked through step by step: when it was found, who signed it out, where it was opened, and the verification protocol that followed. The point is not theater, it's to show that every conclusion rests on a process someone can check. Forensic testimony is kept tight. The pathologist explains limits. Partial remains restrict the ability to name a specific mechanism of death. But classification as homicide is based on the convergence you've already heard in earlier chapters: identity plus indoor patterning plus post-event handling. The DNA analyst explains distribution and absence. The latent print examiner speaks to repeated touches in a tight area during the silence window. The digital examiner outlines the router and device inactivity that overlaps the last verified contact with Wilma. Each expert stays in lane. Together, they form a sequence: presence, event, handling. Defense strategy aims where it should, at the gaps. Without a full body and without a camera capturing the act, the defense emphasizes uncertainty about how death occurred and whether any handling could be unrelated or old. They test timelines, question the precision of router clocks, and push alternative explanations for touch patterns in a shared space. That's the work they're supposed to do. The state's answer isn't a speech, it's the same alignment you've seen: identity anchored to the apartment, a silence window that matches the room's inactivity, and conduct that can't be reconciled with an innocent evening gone wrong out in town. The court weighs credibility, not volume. When witnesses repeat statements from re-interviews, times, movements, what was touched, their words are matched to the logs. Where an account diverges from digital facts, the divergence is marked. Where it fits, it stands. Jurors are reminded that the law does not require an eyewitness or a single miracle exhibit. It requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In a case with one scene and one tight window, convergence is the proof. The verdict from the district court is guilty on both counts, with life imprisonment imposed at first instance. The reasoning is plain: a homicide proven indoors by physical and digital evidence, followed by deliberate handling of remains within the same space and interval. The ruling doesn't claim to know motive. It doesn't need to. It finds that the only story consistent with the evidence is that Wilma died in that apartment and that the handling that followed was intentional. Sentencing reflects the seriousness of the conduct and the circumstances proved, not speculation. The narrative stays one lane wide. There is no second scene, no alternate ending. What follows is appellate review. Sweden's court system can leave the conviction intact while recalibrating the sentence under national standards. That is scrutiny, not a different story. We'll get there next, with the same discipline, facts that stand when the process tests them. An appeal isn't a new story, it's a stress test. The defense challenges the first instance life sentence, not by inventing an outdoor scene or a stranger, but by pressing limits, partial remains, absence of a named mechanism of death, and whether life was proportionate under Swedish law. The Court of Appeal reviews the same spine you followed, identity confirmed as Wilma Anderson, an indoor event anchored to one apartment in Uddevalla, post-event handling inside that same space, and a compressed window that fits the evidence. None of that is thrown out. The court keeps the conviction. What changes is calibration. Swedish sentencing draws a line between premeditated, particularly aggravated homicide that warrants life in cases where the evidence proves murder beyond a reasonable doubt without meeting the highest aggravation threshold. The appellate panel accepts the convergence, biology, touch clusters, digital silence, as proof of homicide and handling, but it finds the record short of the planning or extreme circumstances needed to keep a life term. The outcome, guilty upheld, sentence adjusted to 18 years. That is not a second ending, it's the same verdict with a different number because the statute demands precision about aggravation, not because the evidence grew weaker on guilt. The court's written reasoning is disciplined. It points to the indoor pattern, the sealed atom identification, and conduct after death as decisive on responsibility. It also notes the limitations that come with partial recovery. The pathologist can't describe a complete mechanism, and there is no film of the act. Those limits don't create doubt about who is responsible, they create doubt about whether the highest penalty is justified. The panel therefore imposes a fixed term that, in Sweden, sits near the top of the scale for murder when life is not imposed. For families, sentence recalibration is hard to hear. The legal system speaks in elements: intent, planning, aggravation. Grief speaks in loss. This is where clarity matters for anyone following along from a U.S. perspective. In many American jurisdictions, the same convergence, indoor event, identification, conduct, can support life without parole. In Sweden, the life threshold is read more narrowly, and appellate courts use it sparingly. Different frameworks, same core finding: the person convicted is responsible for Wilma's death and what followed in that apartment. After the appeal, there is one more stop. The defense seeks review by the Supreme Court. That court declines to take the case. The conviction and the 18-year sentence stand. There are no alternate outcomes, no maybe version that competes with the record. The single arc you've been watching remains intact: disappearance, single scene proof, guilty verdict, and now a final sentence under national standards. If you've ever felt lost in true crime content because the ground keeps shifting, this is the opposite: one scene, one timeline, one adjudication, tested and affirmed. A brief human note belongs here. Legal precision is not indifference. It is how systems say we will be exact because the stakes are permanent. Families deserve that. Defendants deserve that. The appellate record, however technical it sounds, is part of accountability. It tells a community that a verdict wasn't assumed, it was measured, and it held. The file now moves from courts to custody, classification inside the prison system, restrictions suited to risk, and a long stretch of time where the facts don't change. The investigation phase is over. The public phase becomes memory: who Wilma was, what the case proved, and how a small apartment came to hold the truth no rumor could carry. The courtroom is quiet now. The investigation is closed. What remains is the part that rarely gets told well: how a community lives with a verdict when most of a young woman's remains were never recovered. In Uddevalla, people remember Wilma Anderson not as a headline but as a 17-year-old whose absence changed the rhythm of ordinary life. Memorials are modest and deliberate. The tone isn't spectacle. It's accuracy. Families and neighbors learned early that holding to verified facts protects everyone, protects the case, protects the memory, and protects the public from rumors pretending to be answers. Legally, the file is settled. The district court convicted on murder and post-offense handling of remains, and the Court of Appeal kept those findings in place while adjusting the sentence to 18 years under Swedish standards. The Supreme Court declined review. That is a single adjudication arc, not two competing endings. The difference between life and 18 years can sound like backtracking to anyone used to American sentencing, but in Sweden it reflects a narrower reading of when life is warranted. The appellate panel accepted the same spine you followed: identity confirmed inside the apartment, an indoor event, handling after death, and a compressed window that fits the evidence. What changed is not guilt, it's where the case lands on the statutory scale of aggravation. Custody after appeal is bureaucratic, not cinematic. Classification, placement, and restrictions track risk, history, and the fixed term. None of that alters the facts proved, and none of it adds a new chapter to the story. The record stays what it is: one apartment, one timeline, one responsible party identified by converging proof. If you're here because you value clarity in true crime, this is the part worth underlining. A case can end without a body in full. It can be proven by the alignment of biology, touch evidence, and digital silence when those lines point to the same room and the same minutes. That's not an editing trick, it's how modern investigations meet the burden of proof. There's a human cost to partial recovery that doesn't fit neatly into legal elements. For families, ceremonies are complicated when there is no complete return. That gap is not a narrative device, it's a reality that sits with people long after a file number goes inactive. The responsible way to speak about that is to acknowledge it, not fill it with fiction. Precision is a form of respect, for Wilma, for her family, and even for the process that must be exact because the consequences are permanent. For the audience who watches cases like this to learn, two lessons hold. First, scene discipline matters. From the start, investigators stayed with a single locus, the apartment, and avoided inventing outdoor scenes for dramatic effect. That consistency is why there's no late series contradiction about no body versus evidence at home. Second, convergence beats conjecture. Identity inside the unit, a network and device timeline that went silent in the same interval, and clustered touches around a key area, none of those on their own tells the whole story. Together, they meet the standard. That's the difference between a story you can watch and a case you can defend. Public safety takeaways don't need to be preachy to be useful. If you hear a scream or something that doesn't fit the usual noise of a building, report it. Preserve communications when someone goes out of contact. The timestamps you save could anchor a timeline later. Cooperate with lawful requests for devices and records when police are trying to reconstruct a window of minutes. Those actions are small, but they are the reason many cases move from fear to fact. It's also worth saying that restraint has value in content like this. We avoided guessing motive. We avoided decorated language. We didn't add side scenes or dramatic confessions that never existed. That restraint isn't about being cold. It's about being accurate, because accuracy is what honors a victim and gives a community something solid to stand on. In towns like this, crimes don't just break the law, they break routine. The work of investigators, and of responsible storytelling, is to rebuild the sequence so the truth can be seen without noise. As of October 20th, 2025, nothing in the legal posture has changed. The conviction stands. The sentence is 18 years. Most of Wilma's remains have not been found. That is where the record ends and where remembrance begins, with a young person whose life was measured by the same small routines that measure all of ours. The case does not need a twist to be important. It needs to be told clearly once, and then carried forward by people who know the difference between rumor and evidence. I've told this case the way I'd want it told if it were my family: facts first, no noise. What I take from Wilma's story is simple: routine can save lives. When something sounds wrong, report it. Keep the messages, note the times, look out for each other. Accountability isn't about drama, it's about showing up for the truth. Did this ending feel careful enough? What would you change in your building, school, or block to make people safer? If this reached you, drop a comment: where are you watching from, or what didn't work for you? I read it all. And if you want clear, human true crime, please subscribe and stay with us.